Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Every week we share real-life tales of HOAs gone too far, neighbors from hell, and the homeowners who fight back. Subscribing ensures you never miss the next wild twist or shocking reveal. Now, let's begin. It started like any dream of a fresh beginning. After years of saving and months of searching, Marcus believed he had finally found the home that would carry him into the next chapter of his life. Nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac within the Willow Creek subdivision, the two-story house seemed perfect for him and his teenage daughter, Sarah. The neighborhood boasted manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a sparkling artificial lake that residents often described as their crown jewel. It was the kind of place where brochures promised safety, order, and a sense of community. At first glance, everything aligned. The schools were reputable, the streets calm, and the Homeowners Association painted itself as a guardian of standards, protecting property values with unwavering precision. For Marcus, who had just finalized his divorce and wanted a stable environment for Sarah, it seemed like a blessing. The house itself stood proud at the corner, larger than most, with a direct view of the lake that shimmered under the afternoon sun. But dreams often conceal cracks, and what looked like paradise carried its own shadows. Within days of moving in, Marcus began noticing the subtle rigidity of the community. Neighbors' eyes lingered on small details, measuring the exact height of hedges or noting the precise shade of house paint. The HOA newsletters came with smiling clip art but spoke in stern language about fines, compliance, and mandatory fees. The atmosphere wasn't welcoming, it was watchful. Sarah, eager to decorate her new room and explore the neighborhood, quickly noticed the invisible lines drawn between residents. Certain families clustered together in tight groups, whispering at block parties, while others kept their distance. At the center of it all was the HOA board, an entity that seemed to loom over every decision. And though Marcus hadn't met them all yet, one name soon echoed above the rest: Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell was the kind of figure that stories in neighborhoods tend to orbit around. A woman in her early 60s, she lived in the largest house at the edge of the lake, often hosting HOA meetings in her immaculately landscaped backyard. She had a reputation for order, and more importantly, for getting her way. Residents described her as the unofficial mayor of Willow Creek, someone who wielded influence with the HOA president and demanded strict compliance with every rule, whether written or imagined. For the first week, things went smoothly enough. Marcus unpacked, Sarah settled into her routine, and the house felt like a sanctuary. But the turning point came the morning he placed his kayak by the lake. The small boat had been a gift to himself, a symbol of relaxation after years of work stress and personal upheaval. He set it gently against the dock, ready to enjoy the water over the weekend. What he didn't realize was that the dock, and even the lake itself, had been claimed as the territory of the HOA. Though the water shimmered as a shared feature in every promotional pamphlet, the reality was far murkier. The HOA collected fees for its maintenance, regulated its use, and dictated which activities were allowed. Fishing was restricted, swimming banned, and boating required permission. When Marcus's kayak appeared, it was like a flare in the night sky. It didn't take long for word to reach Mrs. Caldwell. By the following morning, neighbors began drifting past his property, their glances sharp and disapproving. Some shook their heads, others whispered to one another, as if Marcus had broken a sacred law. It was only then that he began to understand. The lake wasn't just water, it was power. And power, in Willow Creek, belonged to the HOA. What seemed like a minor choice, placing a kayak near his own home, quickly spiraled into a point of contention. The first letter arrived in his mailbox within 48 hours, sealed with the HOA's emblem and worded with bureaucratic severity. It referenced unauthorized use of common property and threatened fines if the kayak remained. Marcus frowned but set the letter aside, assuming it was a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved at the next meeting. But misunderstandings were not what the HOA thrived on. Behind closed doors, Mrs. Caldwell was already fanning the flames. To her, Marcus represented more than a rule breaker. He was a challenge to her control, an outsider who hadn't yet learned his place. She told her allies that the kayak wasn't just a violation, it was a threat to property values, safety, and the prestige of Willow Creek. Her words traveled fast, and soon whispers turned into accusations. Sarah felt the tension before her father did. At school, a classmate casually mentioned that her mom said the new people don't respect the rules. At the local cafe, Marcus noticed familiar faces glancing at him, their smiles strained. The invisible walls were closing in, one sideways look at a time. When the second letter came, harsher than the first, Marcus realized this wasn't a simple policy issue. It was a test. Either he complied and removed his kayak, bowing to Mrs. Caldwell's authority, or he stood his ground and invited the HOA's full weight upon him. He chose patience, convinced that logic would prevail. But in Willow Creek, logic had long since been replaced by control. The lake grew into a battleground Marcus never anticipated. Each morning, as sunlight painted the water gold, the sight of his kayak resting quietly on the dock became a symbol of resistance in the eyes of some, and defiance in the eyes of others. Mrs. Caldwell saw it as open rebellion, and for someone who built a reputation on order, rebellion could not be tolerated. The pressure mounted in subtle ways. His mailbox was left slightly ajar, his lawn care schedule scrutinized, his driveway noted for the smallest of oil stains. Neighbors who had once waved now crossed the street instead. Even Sarah began to feel isolated, excluded from group chats and ignored by peers. It was as though the community had silently agreed to enforce Mrs. Caldwell's will, one cold shoulder at a time. By the end of the month, Marcus knew he wasn't facing a minor dispute, he was facing a campaign. The HOA wasn't interested in compromise, it was interested in dominance. And Mrs. Caldwell, the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek, had marked him as her latest adversary. He tried to reason with himself that it would blow over, that sooner or later, the HOA would turn its attention elsewhere. But deep down, a gnawing realization began to take hold. This was only the beginning. And so, with the kayak still resting at the edge of the lake and the HOA's letters growing sharper by the week, Marcus unknowingly stepped into a war he never asked for. The calm waters of Willow Creek would soon ripple with secrets, betrayals, and battles far beyond a simple kayak. The storm was coming. The first letter had felt like a warning, the second like a demand. By the time the third arrived, Marcus realized the HOA's persistence wasn't going to fade. The wording was sharper, the penalties outlined more aggressively, and the threats of legal action had become less veiled. It wasn't just about the kayak anymore. It was about submission. The pattern was clear. Each week brought a new complaint, a fresh violation notice. The letters no longer focused solely on the lake. They began targeting his yard, his paint, even the position of his trash bins. The accusations seemed endless, and while each one might have appeared minor on its own, together they painted a portrait of a homeowner perpetually in violation. Marcus knew what was happening. It was a strategy, a tactic of harassment meant to overwhelm him into compliance. By burying him under constant scrutiny, the HOA hoped to break his resolve. But what struck him most was how systematic it all felt, as though every move had been carefully calculated long before his kayak ever touched the water. Neighbors began to shift subtly in their interactions. Some who had once waved from across the street now offered nothing but silence. A handful who had once greeted Sarah at the bus stop now pulled their children closer, their eyes wary. It was as if Marcus had been marked, not just as a violator, but as someone to be avoided. The community had chosen sides, and most had chosen Mrs. Caldwell's. The whispers grew louder, too. At the local grocery store, Marcus overheard two women in the next aisle speaking about the new man at the lake who was stirring up trouble. At the park, he caught fragments of conversation about how certain people didn't belong in Willow Creek. The social walls rose higher every day, and what had once been a neighborhood of possibility began to feel like a prison. The HOA board played its part with ruthless efficiency. Their monthly newsletter began featuring thinly veiled reminders about community standards, with bolded phrases about unauthorized property use and the importance of respecting shared resources. Though Marcus's name was never mentioned directly, everyone knew who the message was aimed at. The kayak had become infamous, a symbol of rebellion, a spark that had ignited the HOA's crusade. The surveillance followed soon after. It began with casual observations, neighbors lingering longer than usual as they walked past his home, cars slowing to take an extra look. Then came the photos. Envelopes arrived containing printed images of his property, each marked with times and dates. The photos documented the smallest details: a recycling bin positioned inches too far from the curb, a patch of grass slightly taller than the rest, Sarah's bicycle leaning against the porch railing. It was invasive, relentless, and chilling. At night, Marcus began to notice headlights parked just beyond the corner, engines idling quietly. Whether they belonged to HOA board members or hired patrols, he could never tell. But their message was clear: he was being watched. Every move, every action, every moment of non-compliance would be recorded, catalogued, and weaponized against him. The stress began to wear on Sarah. She returned from school quieter than before, her usual enthusiasm dampened by the weight of whispered gossip and subtle exclusion. Friends who once invited her to birthday parties now overlooked her, and she began to spend more time in her room, headphones shielding her from the growing hostility of the community. Marcus saw the toll it was taking on her, and it filled him with a quiet anger. This was no longer just about him. It was about his family. Financial pressure soon followed. The HOA fines accumulated quickly, each violation carrying a steep fee. Though Marcus contested them, the bills kept arriving, stacking higher with each passing week. The numbers were no longer small. They grew into hundreds, then thousands of dollars. It became a weapon of economic attrition, designed to force him into submission not through reason, but through financial exhaustion. The lake remained at the heart of it all. Each morning, Marcus would see his kayak resting silently against the dock, harmless and still, yet carrying the weight of an entire war. It was never used, never taken into the water, simply existing as a reminder of his defiance. And that was enough to keep the flames alive. To Mrs. Caldwell, it wasn't the boat itself that mattered, it was the principle. If Marcus could defy her once, others might follow. Her control depended on crushing him publicly, decisively. Rumors of HOA legal action began to circulate. Some neighbors whispered about lawsuits, others about forced removal. The words lien and foreclosure began to surface in hushed tones, as though the community was salivating at the thought of seeing Marcus stripped of his home. The cruelty wasn't hidden anymore. It had become a form of entertainment. But beneath the surface of the HOA's aggression lay something Marcus couldn't ignore. The obsession with the lake, the ferocity with which Mrs. Caldwell pursued him, it all hinted at something deeper. This wasn't just about rules. It was about control, yes, but perhaps also about something more tangible. The way Caldwell fought for the lake, as if it were her personal domain, raised questions Marcus hadn't yet found the answers to. Meanwhile, the environment in Willow Creek shifted from cold to hostile. His mailbox was once vandalized with red spray paint. The words "Follow the rules" scrawled across the metal. On another morning, Marcus found tire tracks deliberately pressed into his lawn, a silent act of intimidation. Even Sarah's school projects weren't safe. One poster she had worked on for weeks disappeared from her backpack at the bus stop, only for fragments of it to be found scattered near the lake. The isolation grew unbearable. Marcus considered leaving, packing up and starting over somewhere new. But then he would look at Sarah, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and he knew he couldn't run. This was supposed to be their home, their fresh start. If he fled now, it would teach her that bullies always win, that power always crushes justice. He couldn't let that lesson take root. So he stayed. And with every passing day, his determination hardened. By the end of the second month, Marcus had endured more than most homeowners experience in a lifetime of HOA living. Yet, as much as he tried to endure quietly, the battle was no longer private. Whispers had turned to open gossip, and gossip had turned to open hostility. The lines were drawn, and the neighborhood was choosing sides. And though Marcus didn't yet realize it, the real war hadn't even begun. Because beneath the HOA's crusade against him lay secrets that reached far deeper than any kayak, secrets tied to the lake itself, secrets that would soon shift the entire course of Willow Creek's history. The escalation was only the prelude. When constant pressure builds with no release, something eventually snaps. For Marcus, the breaking point wasn't the fines, the letters, or even the vandalism. It was watching Sarah retreat further into herself, her teenage laughter replaced with silence, her friends slipping away under the weight of neighborhood whispers. That was when he decided enough was enough. The war with the HOA could no longer be endured in silence. It had to be fought. Marcus began with the tools he knew best: documentation and research. He started treating every interaction, every letter, and every incident like evidence. A notebook sat permanently on the kitchen counter, where he jotted down dates, times, and observations. Security cameras, which had once been simple doorbell fixtures, were upgraded into a full perimeter system. Motion-activated lights went up around the house, and every morning, he reviewed the footage with the precision of a detective. Soon, the archive began to grow. Photos of vandalism, videos of suspicious vehicles idling by his home, scanned copies of every threatening letter. Each item found its place in neatly labeled digital folders. The organization was meticulous, born out of his years as a project manager. If the HOA wanted a war of paperwork, then Marcus would fight them with paperwork sharper than theirs. The research phase came next. Late nights that had once been spent watching television or catching up on chores now stretched into hours of combing through municipal codes and state housing laws. He studied the HOA bylaws line by line, learning their every strength and flaw. He discovered loopholes, inconsistencies, and outright overreaches. He found sections that contradicted one another, rules that hadn't been properly updated, and clauses that had never been legally enforceable in the first place. And then came the revelation that shifted everything: the lake. Buried deep in county records, Marcus found that Willow Creek's artificial lake wasn't technically owned by the HOA at all. It was registered as a shared water feature maintained by the association but built on land deeded separately decades earlier by the original developer. That meant the HOA could manage its upkeep, but it didn't actually own the lake. In legal terms, their jurisdiction over its use was far shakier than they claimed. The realization electrified him. For months, the HOA had hammered him with threats over the kayak, all under the banner of authority they might not even have. Their entire campaign could collapse if the truth came out. But Marcus didn't rush. He knew better than to reveal his hand too soon. Instead, he kept building his case, layering evidence, preparing not just for defense but for counterattack. Every week that Mrs. Caldwell pushed harder, every violation letter that arrived in his mailbox, every fine that piled onto his ledger, it all became ammunition. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued its slow suffocation. Caldwell's allies grew bolder, emboldened by her leadership. The fines became absurd: $100 for a lawn 2 millimeters too long, $75 for a recycling bin supposedly placed too close to the curb, $50 for Sarah's bicycle leaning against the porch. It was harassment masquerading as order, and Marcus knew it was designed to wear him down until he gave in or left. But something unexpected happened. Not everyone in Willow Creek supported Caldwell's crusade. Quietly, in hushed tones and cautious glances, a few neighbors began to approach Marcus, not to condemn him, but to sympathize. An older man down the street confessed that he had once been fined for painting his shutters without prior approval. A single mother whispered that Caldwell had harassed her for leaving a stroller on the porch. A retired couple admitted they'd received letters about their garden being too wild, despite its awards from local horticultural societies. The stories added up, painting a picture of a community living under fear. And though many were too afraid to speak publicly, their private admissions fueled Marcus's determination. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been bullied into silence. By the third month, Marcus's strategy began to take shape. He drafted formal complaints to the City Housing Authority, citing the lake's ownership records. He filed public records requests for HOA financial documents, hoping to uncover irregularities in how dues were spent. He even consulted with a property rights attorney, who confirmed what he suspected: the HOA had been enforcing rules they had no legal standing to enforce. But the most crucial weapon in his arsenal was patience. He knew Caldwell's personality now, understood her hunger for control, her need to crush opposition quickly. The longer he resisted, the more desperate she would become. And desperate people made mistakes. The turning point came when Marcus received yet another violation notice, this one claiming his outdoor light fixtures were non-compliant. It was absurd. The lights had been installed by the previous owner and approved years earlier. But instead of arguing, Marcus quietly added the notice to his growing archive. That evening, he cross-referenced his files and found identical fixtures on 5 other homes in the neighborhood. None had received citations. The selective enforcement was blatant. That discovery sparked a deeper dive. Marcus began walking the neighborhood in the early mornings, camera in hand, photographing every technical violation he could find. Overgrown grass, faded shutters, cracked sidewalks, missing house numbers. He documented dozens of them, many far worse than anything he'd been accused of. Yet none of those homeowners had been fined. The evidence of targeting was undeniable. By the end of the 4th month, Marcus had transformed from a victim into a strategist. His garage had become a war room, its walls lined with charts, timelines, and photographs. The kayak dispute had evolved into something far larger, a confrontation not just about property rights but about abuse of power. Mrs. Caldwell, however, was oblivious to how much ground she was losing. From her perspective, Marcus was still under siege, drowning in fines, isolated socially, and under constant scrutiny. She mistook his silence for defeat, never realizing he was building the very case that could dismantle her reign. The neighborhood tension reached its peak at the next HOA board meeting. Caldwell arrived in her usual fashion, commanding the room with polished poise, while Marcus sat quietly in the back. The meeting droned on about landscaping budgets and parking rules, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, Marcus didn't rise. Not yet. He let the meeting end as usual, let Caldwell believe she still held control. Because when the time came to strike, it wouldn't be with a single complaint, it would be with a mountain of evidence. And so the pushback simmered, unseen but growing stronger by the day. Marcus knew the fight wasn't going to end quickly, but for the first time since moving into Willow Creek, he felt a shift in momentum. He was no longer the hunted, he was preparing to hunt. And soon, the secrets buried beneath the HOA's polished facade would begin to crack wide open. The war had started with a kayak, but by the 4th month it had become something far larger. The fines, the surveillance, the endless violation notices, they all pointed to a strategy of intimidation. Yet Marcus sensed that the aggression wasn't just about enforcing rules. Mrs. Caldwell's obsession carried the weight of something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of the neighborhood's polished facade. The first clue came from the financial records. After weeks of paperwork and delays, Marcus finally received a partial set of HOA expense reports through his public records requests. At first glance, the numbers appeared ordinary: landscaping costs, maintenance contracts, insurance premiums. But one line item stood out: Lake Preservation Fund. It wasn't the existence of the fund that caught his attention, it was the size. Tens of thousands of dollars were being siphoned into it every year, far more than what basic upkeep of an artificial lake should reasonably require. Marcus dug deeper. He compared the figures with county contracts and municipal water management costs. What he found made little sense. The HOA was reporting expenditures that far exceeded the amounts paid to actual service providers. Somewhere, money was being redirected. The pattern sharpened when Marcus cross-referenced board meeting minutes. Every time the subject of the lake arose, Mrs. Caldwell had been the one to push aggressively for larger budgets, insisting on necessary preservation measures and specialist contractors. Her influence had steered thousands of dollars into the fund, and no one had questioned her. The residents had simply trusted that their dues were being spent wisely. But trust was the currency Caldwell had weaponized, and Marcus was starting to see the cracks. The second clue emerged from property deeds. In his late-night research sessions, Marcus stumbled across a curious detail. While the HOA maintained the lake, the original deed listed a private company as partial stakeholder. The company had been dormant for years, but a recent filing showed it had been revived. Its registered address matched that of Caldwell's nephew, a contractor in a neighboring town. The implications were staggering. If HOA money was flowing into the so-called Lake Preservation Fund, and that fund was tied to a company connected to Caldwell's family, then the obsession with control wasn't about aesthetics or rules, it was about profit. Every violation, every fine, every act of intimidation designed to protect the lake wasn't about community standards at all. It was about covering up a financial pipeline that enriched those in charge. Marcus's anger hardened into resolve. What had started as harassment over a kayak was now a battle against corruption. Caldwell wasn't just a bully, she was exploiting the very community she claimed to protect. Yet while Marcus pieced together the puzzle, the HOA escalated its campaign against him. The violation letters intensified. New complaints accused him of unauthorized modifications to his home, citing his security cameras and upgraded lighting as breaches of the architectural code. He was fined for supposed excessive noise despite his quiet lifestyle, and even Sarah's presence was targeted when a notice arrived accusing him of nuisance activity because of a single gathering of her friends in the backyard. The harassment was no longer subtle. It was blatant, desperate, and personal. Meanwhile, the neighborhood atmosphere grew more divided. Some residents, emboldened by Caldwell's authority, treated Marcus as an outcast. They whispered as he passed, sent cold stares towards Sarah, and even left anonymous notes on his porch urging him to move out. But others began to see through the facade. Quiet knocks came at his door late in the evening, neighbors who admitted they too had suffered under Caldwell's heavy hand but had been too afraid to resist. An elderly widow confessed that she had been fined for planting unapproved flowers near her mailbox. A young couple revealed they'd been threatened with liens for leaving a holiday decoration up 1 week past the deadline. Their voices trembled as they spoke, their stories carrying the same thread. Mrs. Caldwell's power was absolute, and questioning it meant consequences. For Marcus, these stories confirmed what he already knew. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for an entire community living under fear. The breakthrough came one cold evening when Marcus reviewed footage from his upgraded cameras. At 2 a.m, Caldwell herself appeared on the screen, pacing near his dock with a flashlight. She crouched by the kayak, inspecting it like a detective examining evidence. Then, to Marcus's shock, she snapped photos not of his boat, but of the dock itself. The following morning, A violation notice arrived accusing him of unauthorized alterations to HOA-controlled structures. It was absurd. He hadn't altered anything. But the footage told the real story. Caldwell had been searching for excuses, manufacturing evidence, building a narrative to justify her vendetta. Marcus archived the footage carefully, labeling it Caldwell trespass. He knew it was more than proof of harassment. It was a glimpse into her desperation. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was protecting something, guarding it with a zeal that bordered on obsession. As weeks passed, Marcus pieced the fragments together. The inflated budgets. The dormant company revived under her nephew's name. The personal surveillance, the fabricated violations, the midnight inspections. It all pointed to a truth Caldwell would do anything to hide. The lake was less a community feature and more a personal goldmine. And Marcus, by refusing to remove his kayak, had threatened to expose it. The realization struck with chilling clarity. The kayak had become a symbol of resistance, yes, but more importantly, it had become a threat to Caldwell's control over the lake's financial scheme. If Marcus proved the HOA lacked authority over the water, the carefully constructed illusion of power would crumble. And with it, the flow of money that had lined Caldwell's pockets for years. By the 5th month, Marcus's garage no longer resembled a home workspace. It had transformed into a full-scale investigation hub. Charts and graphs lined the walls. Financial spreadsheets lay scattered across the workbench. Photographs of violations, maps of the lake property lines, and copies of HOA bylaws formed a mosaic of evidence. What had once been a quiet fight over property rights was now a case study in corruption. But Marcus also knew exposure carried risk. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous Caldwell became. She had already escalated from fines to vandalism, from letters to trespassing. How far would she go to protect her scheme if she realized how close Marcus was to unraveling it? The answer began to reveal itself in subtle ways. His truck was keyed while parked at the grocery store. Sarah's school locker was vandalized with notes calling her family troublemakers. Anonymous complaints reached his workplace, questioning his professionalism and ethics. It was clear Caldwell's reach extended beyond the neighborhood, her campaign widening with each week. And yet, Marcus did not break. The more Caldwell struck, the stronger his resolve grew. Because now, it wasn't just about enduring harassment. It was about justice. As winter crept into Willow Creek, the stage was set. Marcus held the evidence. Caldwell held the power. The community was divided, teetering between fear and rebellion. And the lake, shimmering quietly in the cold December air, held the secret that would soon decide everything. The storm was no longer approaching, it had arrived. By the time the new year arrived, Marcus's war room was overflowing with evidence. Every violation notice, every photo, every late-night trespass had been catalogued, cross-referenced, and backed up in multiple formats. His research into the lake's ownership was airtight, his financial analysis unassailable. He had everything he needed to strike. The only question was when. The answer came with the announcement of the HOA's annual meeting. It was the most important gathering of the year, where budgets were approved, board members re-elected, and new rules voted on. Attendance was usually low, with most homeowners preferring to avoid the monotony of financial reports. But Marcus knew this time would be different. He had quietly spread the word to sympathetic neighbors, hinting at what he had discovered. By the time the date arrived, the meeting promised to draw more residents than Caldwell anticipated. The community center buzzed with energy on that chilly evening. Cars filled the parking lot, lining the street in both directions. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, but within minutes they overflowed with residents standing against the walls. The turnout alone was a silent rebuke to Caldwell's reign. For years, the board had operated in comfortable obscurity. Tonight, that shield was gone. Caldwell entered with her usual air of authority, her eyes scanning the room with suspicion. The board members flanked her, stiff and uneasy, aware of the tension that hung in the air. They launched into the agenda with forced calm, budget allocations, landscaping updates, enforcement statistics. But the crowd's restlessness grew with each passing minute. They weren't there for numbers. They were there for answers. When the floor finally opened to homeowners, Marcus rose. He carried a binder thick with documents, a laptop tucked under his arm, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew he held the truth. The room hushed, the weight of anticipation pressing down on every chair and every breath. He began not with accusations, but with facts. He laid out the evidence of selective enforcement, presenting photographs of identical violations ignored across the neighborhood. He detailed the harassment campaign, vandalism, surveillance, and fabricated notices, backed by time-stamped images and video clips. Each page of proof chipped away at the HOA's credibility, eroding the board's facade of fairness. Then came the financials. Marcus displayed charts comparing the HOA's reported lake expenses against actual service provider invoices. The discrepancies were staggering, thousands of dollars unaccounted for, year after year. He revealed the existence of the revived company tied to Caldwell's nephew, the funneling of contracts into its accounts, and the clear conflict of interest that had been hidden from residents. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For many, it was the first time they had seen their dues translated into hard numbers, and the betrayal stung. The lake, once a symbol of neighborhood pride, had become a siphon for corruption. Caldwell's obsession now had context. It wasn't about beauty or order. It was about money. Caldwell attempted to interject, her voice sharp and dismissive. But Marcus pressed on, unveiling the crown jewel of his case, the county deed records. He projected them for the room to see, highlighting the legal reality that the HOA did not own the lake. Their authority to regulate its use had always been tenuous, built on bluster rather than law. Every violation tied to the kayak, every fine connected to the dock, every threat they had leveled against him rested on a foundation of sand. The silence that followed was deafening. For years, residents had accepted Caldwell's word as gospel, believing her claims of authority without question. Now, with evidence laid bare, her empire of control looked less like order and more like tyranny. The crowd shifted. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into pointed questions. Why had their fees risen so steeply? Where had the money gone? Why had Caldwell pushed so fiercely to control the lake if it wasn't even theirs? The trust she had cultivated for decades was collapsing in real time, replaced by suspicion and anger. But Caldwell didn't yield. Her pride wouldn't allow it. She lashed out instead, deflecting blame, accusing Marcus of fabrication, insisting his evidence was misleading. Yet the more she spoke, the more the residents turned against her. Her fury, once intimidating, now looked desperate. The board members fidgeted under the weight of the scrutiny. Their loyalty to Caldwell wavered as they realized they were being dragged into the spotlight with her. Some avoided eye contact altogether, their silence an admission of complicity. The meeting descended into chaos. Homeowners shouted demands for audits, refunds, and resignations. Years of frustration, once bottled up under Caldwell's iron grip, erupted like a dam breaking. The room was no longer hers to control. It belonged to the people she had ruled through fear. For Marcus, it was vindication. Months of harassment, isolation, and intimidation had led to this moment, and the truth was undeniable. The lake wasn't Caldwell's to control. The money trail exposed her corruption, and the community had finally seen through the lies. But victory came with a warning. Caldwell's eyes, burning with rage, fixed on Marcus as if promising retaliation. Though her empire had been shaken, she wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. As the meeting adjourned in chaos, residents spilled into the parking lot, buzzing with disbelief and anger. Some congratulated Marcus quietly, their gratitude mingled with fear of being seen. Others vented openly, furious at how long they had been deceived. The neighborhood was no longer united under Caldwell's rule. It was fractured, unstable, and unpredictable. Back at home, Marcus sat in his garage, staring at the walls of evidence. He had exposed the truth, but exposure alone wasn't enough. Caldwell still held the board's presidency. She still had allies, still had access to HOA funds, still had the ability to retaliate. And he knew she would. The confrontation at the meeting was only the beginning of the end. The real battle was about to start, the battle for accountability, for restitution, for justice that would leave no doubt about who truly controlled Willow Creek. And as Marcus prepared for what came next, one thought stayed with him. Caldwell's desperation was dangerous. She had too much to lose, and people with too much to lose rarely went quietly. The breaking point had been reached. The fallout was only beginning. The night of the annual meeting marked a turning point in Willow Creek. For years, Mrs. Caldwell had ruled through fear, wielding fines and violations like weapons, confident her control would never be challenged. But after Marcus's presentation, her grip slipped. The community had seen too much. The illusion of order had cracked, and once cracks appear, they spread. The fallout began almost immediately. Within 48 hours, a petition circulated demanding a full audit of HOA finances. Dozens of homeowners signed in the first day, their names flowing onto the page with a mixture of anger and relief. For many, it was the first time they had openly defied Caldwell. The silence of fear was breaking. Local media caught wind of the story next. A reporter from a regional paper attended the following board meeting, her notepad flashing under the fluorescent lights. The presence of a journalist transformed the atmosphere. Board members who once parroted Caldwell's authority now hesitated, their words cautious, their confidence shaken. What had once been a closed circle of control was suddenly under public scrutiny. The audit revealed what Marcus had already suspected. The Lake Preservation Fund had been manipulated for years, its funds funneled into contracts awarded to Caldwell's nephew's company. The numbers didn't lie: inflated invoices, duplicate payments, and fabricated expenses totaling tens of thousands of dollars. Residents who had faithfully paid their dues for years discovered they had been financing Caldwell's scheme all along. The outrage was volcanic. Homeowners who had once feared confrontation now demanded accountability. Caldwell's allies deserted her, unwilling to sink with a ship so clearly going down. Her once loyal board fractured, with members resigning one by one until only she remained, clinging to a presidency that no longer held legitimacy. The legal consequences followed swiftly. County investigators, armed with Marcus's evidence and the results of the audit, opened a formal inquiry. Caldwell was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of authority within a non-profit organization. Court documents laid bare the pattern of deception, her midnight inspections, and her relentless campaign of harassment against Marcus. The woman who had once terrorized a neighborhood with letters and fines now faced the far heavier weight of the law. For Marcus, vindication came slowly, not as a triumphant moment, but as a steady release of pressure. The fines against him were nullified, the violation notices voided. The HOA, under interim leadership, issued a formal apology, though its words were hollow compared to the months of torment he and Sarah had endured. Yet as the neighborhood shifted, he could feel the change. The stares at the grocery store softened, whispers turned into greetings, and Sarah's isolation at school began to ease as her classmates' parents adjusted their tones. The kayak, still resting quietly by the dock, became a symbol of resilience. What had once been the spark of a war now stood as a quiet monument to perseverance. Neighbors who had once scorned it now admired it, understanding what it had represented. Some even joked about buying their own, though Marcus knew few had the appetite for the kind of battle he had fought. As the weeks turned into months, Willow Creek began to rebuild. The HOA underwent sweeping reform, guided by a new board elected in Caldwell's absence. Transparency became their watchword. Budgets were published openly, contracts awarded through competitive bidding, enforcement handled with fairness instead of favoritism. It was not a perfect transformation, but it was progress. For the first time, the lake became what it was always meant to be, a shared feature for the community, not a weapon of control. Families fished along its edges, children skipped stones across its surface, and Marcus and Sarah finally took the kayak out onto the water. The ripples it left behind were small, but symbolic, a quiet reclaiming of something long denied. Caldwell's downfall rippled far beyond Willow Creek. Her conviction became a cautionary tale, cited in regional discussions about HOA reform. Advocacy groups used the case to push for stricter oversight of homeowner associations, pointing to Marcus's evidence as proof of how easily power could be abused. What had started as one man's fight against harassment became part of a larger conversation about accountability. But for Marcus, the victory was more personal. He had not only defended his rights but taught his daughter a lesson far more valuable than anything in a civics textbook. Sarah had watched him endure harassment, isolation, and fear, yet refused to bend. She had seen him document, research, and strategize, choosing patience and evidence over anger or retreat. She had learned that standing up for what was right often comes at a cost, but that the cost is worth paying when the alternative is surrender. Their home, once filled with anxiety, slowly regained warmth. Sarah's laughter returned, drifting down the hallways once more. The kitchen table, once covered with violation letters and legal documents, was cleared for meals and conversations. And the garage, which had served as a war room, gradually emptied as boxes of evidence were sealed and archived, no longer needed. The scars of the battle remained, of course. Some neighbors still looked away, ashamed of their silence during Caldwell's reign. Others apologized quietly, admitting they had been too afraid to resist. Marcus accepted it all with calm understanding. Fear was a powerful tool, and Caldwell had wielded it well. But fear only holds power until someone breaks it. On a bright spring morning, nearly a year after the first violation notice, Marcus stood by the lake with Sarah. The water shimmered, clear and calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The dock stretched quietly into the surface, the kayak resting at its edge. He thought of everything the lake had represented: conflict, corruption, resilience, justice, and felt a strange gratitude. Without the battle, he might never have discovered the strength within himself, or the quiet courage of his daughter, or the hidden cracks in a community that needed repair. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus realized the war was over. Caldwell's empire had collapsed, the HOA had reformed, and his family had endured. What had begun as a fight over a simple kayak had ended as a victory for justice. And in the silence of that morning, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the dock, peace finally returned to Willow Creek.